Perhaps you've seen the YouTube video entitled "It's Not About the Nail." The portrayal just shows a woman describing her problems to her husband or maybe her boyfriend, and as the camera pans around to the front of her face, we see that the problems she's describing are actually caused by a nail literally stuck in her forehead. The man tries to give her helpful responses, but in typical masculine style, he tries to solve her problem. She responds by rebuffing his attempts to solve her problem, asking only that he listen and understand. It plays on some stereotypes, and it's meant to be funny, but we found ourselves in those situations. We find ourselves in situations where people are trying to share with us what's taking place in their lives, the problems that they're having, or maybe the hopes that they have, and we want to provide a helpful response. Throughout any given week, people find themselves facing vulnerable self-disclosures. Let me define self-disclosure to begin with. Self-disclosure is the process of sharing information with others that would not otherwise be known to them. Self-disclosure involves allowing people inside our own self-perception and describing it to them. Now, this may be simply things about our history that may not be obvious to them, or it may be information about our health, or something about our competencies, like in a job interview. But vulnerable self-disclosures are self-disclosures that involve sharing aspects of ourselves that are most closely related to our identity, most closely related to our sense of ourselves. These could be secrets that we have. Perhaps somebody shares a secret of abuse that was done years ago in their life that they have kept quiet for many years. When a person finally comes to a point of self-disclosing that abuse, it is a vulnerable self-disclosure. More positively, it can also be hopes. A person might be willing to say that they hope to achieve something. Maybe they want to write a novel. Maybe they want to lose weight. But they express that hope to you, and that's a vulnerable self-disclosure. They're revealing part of who they are. Those vulnerable self-disclosures may also be hurts, experiences that they're having. Perhaps a loved one is going through a difficult bout with cancer, or perhaps they've got a strange friendship that's causing them grief and pain. Those hurts are hard to talk about, and so to share those with another person is a vulnerable self-disclosure. Vulnerable self-disclosures are about self-perception. When a person is willing to say, this is something I think I'm good at. This is something that I think I excel at. This is a quality that I value about themselves. That's a vulnerable self-disclosure. As well, if people are willing to share either their guilt over past actions or their shame about some aspect of who they are, that's also a moment of vulnerable self-disclosure. Brené Brown, a social worker in Houston, in a recent TED Talk said, in order to have meaningful connection, we have to be seen, really seen. And that being really seen, well, that's vulnerable self-disclosure. Vulnerable self-disclosures are significant. That is to say, they are significant to our personal development. They may also be significant to who we are as people. Paul Tournier, a Swiss psychiatrist, one of the foundational leaders in modern psychiatry, said, no one can develop freely in this world and find a full life without feeling understood by at least one person. Research by John Sicipio indicates that there is a significant correlation between loneliness and a person's physical health. He did a longitudinal study of 200 middle-aged and older adults in and around Chicago and found that loneliness contributes to depression, loneliness contributes to higher blood pressure, and loneliness has physiological signs of stress. He said loneliness leads to poor health behaviors, but only the ones of the impulsive kind, anything that could be damaging, but that's pleasurable. So higher fat and sugar in the diet, alcoholism, drug addiction, and less exercise. These all come from a sense of loneliness. But that's what happens to the individual. Does this really matter in terms of society as a whole? Well, indeed it does. Research done about 15 years ago by Robert Putnam that was published in a groundbreaking book entitled Bowling Alone describes a quality that exists within communities called social capital. Social capital has to do with how well people know those around them in their immediate vicinity. The title, Bowling Alone, came from some research that indicated that more people are bowling today than they were in previous decades, but that fewer people are bowling in leagues. They're not joining. They are bowling alone. This lack of association looks at things like the Kiwanis Club or Rotary Club or civic organizations, the Elks Lodge, also at church attendance, participation in PTA, participation in city council meetings and city elections. But it basically boils down to how well do the people know the people around them. And social capital, Putnam argues, functions much like monetary capital. That is, communities with higher social capital are able to achieve greater corporate successes than communities with lower social capital. Social capital's link to vulnerable self-disclosure is a big stretch, but they are closely connected because what people need in relationship is inclusion, affection, and control. Part of how we respond to people in those interactions determines whether or not they meet their interpersonal needs in interrelationships with us. Thus, if people have positive experiences in interpersonal relationships with us, then their likelihood to engage in meaningful relationships goes up. If the relationship experiences are negative, their relationship goes down. And if that is a consistent trend across a community, then the community's social capital is likely to decrease. So it does matter to all of us that we find ways to respond helpfully to those vulnerable self-disclosures. At a more basic level, I just think that I have this hunch that you believe that we are all healthier when we are all healthier. And so it matters to you to provide vulnerable self-disclosures in order to contribute to provide helpful responses to vulnerable self-disclosure because that's what leads to greater health. So here are three things to think about in terms of helpful responses to vulnerable self-disclosures. Helpful responses to vulnerable self-disclosures involve acceptance, affirmation, and hope. First, helpful responses convey acceptance. Acceptance is an acceptance of the person, not necessarily acceptance of what they are describing. There are, of course, boundaries that we have to observe within ourselves. Someone may disclose to us something that we find truly abhorrent, and we would either have to report that to legal authorities, or we would have to say that we could not maintain in good conscience a continued relationship with them. But if what we want to do is provide a genuine, helpful response, and we can engage a person without judgment, then we accept them as people. John Powell, the author of Why Am I Afraid to Tell You Who I Am, answered his own question by saying, I am afraid to tell you who I am because you may not like who I am, and it is all I have. That sense of vulnerability is what we're getting at when we talk about those vulnerable self-disclosures. And if a person can receive acceptance, then they know that they can take the next step in sharing more of who they are. But beyond that, a vulnerable self-disclosure needs to be met with a sense of affirmation. Now, affirmation is not the same thing as approval. A person may be self-disclosing that they have a habit that's negative. Maybe they're eating too much, or maybe they're drinking too much. Maybe they have explosive anger, and they're disclosing these things about themselves that they really want to change. Affirmation is not a dismissal of that particular behavior. You may indeed want to agree with them that they should change those behaviors about themselves. Rather, affirmation expresses a sense of faith that the person is capable of changing what they want to change about themselves. Finally, a helpful response conveys hope. Hope is the sense that a person's actions can change their outcome in the future. Many people do not find the motivation to make the changes they need to make in their lives because they simply do not believe that those changes will bring about any change in their outcome, that they won't be able to solve their problems, that they will fail yet again. A helpful response casts a future story in which a person has a sense of hope. So helpful responses can make a difference. Helpful responses are those that convey acceptance, convey affirmation, and convey hope. Notice what the helpful responses don't necessarily do. They don't necessarily offer advice. Trying to tell people how to solve their problem often ends in a negative conversation where a person doesn't feel heard or where the advice given really doesn't help answer any questions. We offer suggestions about how to solve problems because those vulnerable self-disclosures are difficult to hear, and we want a way to be helpful in the conversation, but also get out of the conversation as quickly as possible. The helpful responses that I'm suggesting here give us some clue as to what we can do rather than trying to solve a person's problem. We can try to convey acceptance, we can convey affirmation, and express our sense that they have the capacity to solve their problems, and we can convey hope, that indeed we believe that they can take actions that will either solve their problem or ameliorate their problem. Putting that hope before them is a helpful response. Scipio says that the answer to loneliness is not the number of relationships a person has, but about the quality of relationships a person has. Learning to provide helpful responses is one way to to create better relationships and to increase the quality of those relationships. We may not be able to remove the nail that's stuck between in their forehead, but we may be able to empower them to remove the nail themselves.